Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of a series of video programs on postgraduate research, supervision and training. This video series has been produced simply from recordings of a residential staff development program on postgraduate supervision for women held at the Twin Waters Resort on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland in April 1992. The aim of this series is to provide supervisors and postgraduate students with resources to understand and improve postgraduate studies in their department or institution.
What is the role of the postgraduate supervisor?
In my opinion, the role of the supervisor is to support and guide the student through the whole process of doing a PhD. And at different times, the supervisor's role will change. It need not necessarily be that the supervisor is more guiding and directive at the beginning and then gradually weaning the student off until at the end the student is totally autonomous. Because at different periods of the student's registration, he or she will be doing different things, and therefore the supervisor has to be sensitive to what the needs of the student are at that time.
As far as institutions are concerned, they have very clear expectations of a staff member as supervisor assisting the students to come from a novice position as researcher to one where they can actually go out and do postdoctoral work on their own and possibly supervise postgrad students themselves. As far as the students are concerned, they have many expectations of the supervisor. Certainly one of them is to be available as an experienced researcher who can assist the student in formulating the research question, in giving them some guidance on how one might structure the whole 3 or 4 year process on all of the different stages of the project. As far as staff are concerned, when you look at roles, you could say the supervisor plays more than one role. And there are lots of descriptions. You could say at one stage, a supervisor might be a mentor, might be someone who encourages, might be someone who advises, might be a friend. At another level, you would say that the supervisor is someone who's an experienced researcher critiquing, who is not only a colleague right now in the research enterprise, but also a future colleague.
Well, I think probably the supervisor's role is primarily to teach students what the system is. It's about inducting people into the process of becoming a researcher, and that means that you're a guide and a facilitator and sometimes a nurturer and a whole string of other things. You're there to make the system work for the student and make the student understand the system as much as possible. And that means understanding the system of examination, understanding the system of annual reports or twice-yearly reports or whatever goes on administratively within the department, as well as all the intellectual demands of being a PhD student.
Almost unconsciously, I think, a supervisor, if it's a successful supervisory relationship, teaches the student how to become their own supervisor. And I think ultimately that's what it's all about.
And so the supervisor has to vary the amount of input and has to be sensitive to the student's needs at all times. And so the supervisor can be at one stage someone who pushes you, at other times someone who encourages you, who gives you advice, who acts as a sounding board when you yourself know what you're doing, or you've got to really think out aloud. And at other times might actually direct, because from experience the supervisor will know that unless you have these resources or you narrow down your topic or whatever, you will not be able to do your thesis in the prescribed time, with perhaps 6 months longer. So there's a very heavy responsibility for the supervisor in actually making sure that the student has a topic which has enough scope to demonstrate originality and extending the frontiers of knowledge.
Please stop the tape to discuss the role of the postgraduate supervisor. Who is responsible for the presentation and quality of the final thesis?
Responsibility for the presentation and the quality of the thesis seems to me to be ultimately the student's responsibility. The complication is that a supervisor has an investment in that thesis too. It reflects very badly on a supervisor if a thesis goes wrong, if a student fails, if the methodology is questioned by the examiners, because the supervisor should have known enough to avoid that for the student, or to have the student avoid it. The only real disasters I know of, after having read a lot of examiners' reports, were students who didn't accept their supervisor's advice and who proceeded against the supervisor's advice about a certain methodology or certain presentation or something, and insisted on submitting. And those were very painful cases for the supervisors as well, because it looks bad for them. But it is the student's responsibility. It's their work. This is the end of the road as far as their education is concerned, and they have to accept the responsibility.
The person responsible for the quality and presentation of the final thesis ultimately is the student. It's the student's work, and the new doctorate that the student becomes has to own that work. Nevertheless, the supervisor is very involved with it and probably has an emotional commitment to it as well. And very often, in Britain we have a viva. I know you don't have that here in Australia, but after the oral examination, when everybody's present, the supervisor and the student and the examining board, it's the supervisor that's congratulated when the student performs well at the viva. So that's the degree of involvement that the supervisor ultimately has. Nevertheless, I am quite convinced that the student owns the work, and with the supervisor's help, the quality of the work should be assured, but it's still up to the student to make sure that it is high quality.
Most universities expect the supervisor to read drafts, to comment critically on them, and to see that the thesis is succinctly written, well documented, within the prescribed page limits and so on. So they are overseeing, overviewing responsibilities, but in the final analysis, it is the student's responsibility that the student, him or herself, presents a thesis of merit. It is recognized in most university rules that students have a right to submit a thesis even against the wish of the supervisor, and so that acknowledges that it is the student's own work. And when you actually look later in life of what a thesis can mean for a student in terms of future employment, but most of all in the skills which a student has learned, then this actually having done it on yourself becomes of primary importance, because that is the best chance students ever have to learn and to tap into the knowledge of academics available. So it is their responsibility, as I said, but the supervisors have very clear responsibilities in guiding this process.
Please stop the tape to discuss who is responsible for the presentation and quality of the final thesis. How can students develop research and dissertation writing skills?
Students learn to develop research and dissertation writing skills throughout the whole period of their registration. That's really what being a PhD student is all about. There are different techniques and strategies that can be employed to help them, once again at different times, depending on where they're at. But I'm a great believer in encouraging them to show their work to people other than the supervisor in the first instance, so that I, as supervisor, don't see a first draft, I actually see something that's improved. And it gives the student the opportunity to share what they're doing with people who are important to them, because it's a very good way for PhD students to let significant people in their lives, whether it's a parent or a partner or a close friend, know what they're doing without boring them by talking about it all the time, or letting them feel that they're in a world of their own where nobody understands or cares about what they're doing, which is usually the lot of the research student. I think that if students develop kind of self-help groups, it might just be a dyad, or it might be more than 2, 3 or 4 people that meet together regularly and exchange drafts of their work as they're doing it, then they learn not only from the feedback of their peers, other postgraduates who are writing at the same time, but they also develop the opportunity to criticise, to learn how to criticise other people's work. They develop the skill of critiquing written work. It's much easier to do it for other people than it is for yourself. But through this process of looking at drafts of their peers and hearing the comments of their peers and being able to practice commenting on other people's work, they gradually learn, after a long time, how to look at their own work in a critical way and to become their own critics.
Yes, students need to develop research and dissertation writing skills, and I do think they need to develop them well before they start PhD studies. I find it quite worrying that there are still a lot of undergraduate degrees, past degrees, where students have written very little, and where students haven't conducted anything which you could call a research project. I think for any graduate, these are vital skills. And all of our curricula, it doesn't matter in which faculty, need to address the need of our graduates to develop research skills and writing skills. Given that, there is certainly within the PhD process a place for honing these skills and developing them further. And that comes back to how to structure the 3 or the 3.5 years. And the research skills are meant to have been developed to some extent already in the honors year or in the equivalent. But at the beginning, certainly, of the higher degree candidature, students need to demonstrate that they can evaluate literature and that they can evaluate methodologies, and they should do that in writing. And the supervisor should really negotiate with each student a program of addressing particular questions and writing about them. And some of that will feed into the final thesis, but some of it might not, but it will broaden the student and prepare the student better to actually end up with a thesis of merit. And if students or supervisors are not really quite sure about the writing ability of the student, then really the student needs to demonstrate it and must have opportunity to write and get feedback. And there are very many ways to go about it. I mentioned writing up parts of the literature or doing critical reviews, but also writing conference papers and presenting them to a wider audience is a very good discipline for the student. There are also other ways, like getting other students in a peer support system to comment on the writing, because it enhances their critical skills, their evaluative skills, and it gives feedback to the student. But I think quite clearly, right through the process, the student needs to write.
Students don't learn to develop dissertation skills or research skills all of a sudden. It's something that happens gradually over the whole course of their education. And it probably starts long before we think it does. Certainly some good high school syllabi are now putting emphasis on research skills, on learning to use sources and things like that. That's the beginning of it. When you get to PhD enrollments, those are people who should already have a fairly high level of skill. And the supervisor's providing the next stage in the continuum of development through advice, counseling, guidance, and whatever. I've also got a fair bit of commitment to facilitating or making available opportunities for students to interact with each other through workshops or seminar programs and that sort of thing. And I think sometimes the final polishing of those skills, the bringing them to the very sophisticated advanced level that we expect of a PhD graduate, happens through their interaction with other students and through their exchange of advice, counsel, and expertise with each other. But it's not something that happens at the last minute. If it hasn't started a long time earlier, we don't have an awful lot of hope of developing that kind of skill, that level of skill at a PhD.
Please stop the tape to discuss how students can develop research and dissertation writing skills.